Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nicholas Haag. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode. Today we want to dive a bit into breathwork, a topic that has been gaining popularity, I have the feeling, a lot in the last couple of years, maybe in the last 5 years or so. And there is so many different modalities out there. There is soma breathwork, psychedelic breathwork, Wim Hof breathwork, rebirthing breathwork, holotropic breathwork. I don't even know all of them. You can find so many of them. And I think some of them are really interesting. I've dabbled a bit in some of them, and I would be super interested to learn more about some of these. So, where could we start? Maybe breath work. Maybe let's start with what's the difference between like normal breathing and breath work.
Yeah, I think when you're saying breath work, most people are going to think about consciously, intentionally controlling your breath to elicit a particular type of response. Although I'd add in the caveat that there are types of breath work that are essentially trying not to control your breath, right? Like I think there's one called normal breathing where you're just essentially kind of trying to let the body take over. There is still a little bit of intentionality there in the sense that it's trying to find a more natural rhythm and less resistance in the breathing. So yeah, it's a pretty broad umbrella in general. Though I'd say most of the time when you're thinking about breath work, it's something where you're consciously controlling the breath, intentionally altering it in order to produce certain types of effects.
Okay, so we're gonna alter our breath for certain periods of time because we want to achieve something. We want to either alter a state of consciousness or maybe alter a physical state. What what can we actually expect? Like, what could be some of the goals of breathwork? What is possible with breathwork?
Yeah, I think, what originally got me into it, and I think what brings a lot of other people to it is to increase emotional fluidity, right? To potentially help process trauma or process, you could say, repressed emotions, to really bring some of that to the surface and then use the breath as a vehicle to move it, essentially to unblock it in a way. So I think that's one of the main things that brings people to breath work. But I mean, the possibilities are pretty vast. You can alter the state of your nervous system. I mean, inevitably, anytime that you're going to change the way that you're breathing, you are going to alter the state of your nervous system to some degree, certainly on a chemical, on a physiological level, right? I mean, on you mentioned Wim Hof, so there are breathing like Tumo, where you can generate actually a lot of heat in the body, right? You can cool the body down with certain techniques, and you can also heat the body up, pretty significantly. I mean, there are stories of like monks and very cold climates drying wet towels on their back by following certain breathing techniques, bare chested and stuff in freezing weather, right? So you can do all sorts of things with breath work. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you can do so with breath work or with breathing, something that we do all the time. But if we do it somewhat intentionally or in a certain framework, then suddenly we get access to, like you said, controlling your nervous system or influencing your nervous system. And at least I read that with pranayama you can influence your autonomic nervous system. So that's something where we uh, usually believe that, like, that's why it's even called autonomic, because it's controlled by the body itself, not by us consciously, but somehow we can influence it or we can change our state of mind. It's really fascinating that there's this possibility kind of hiding in plain sight, and you know just waiting for us to change our rhythm of breath, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, it is really fascinating. And I think a lot of the stuff, if you look into Wim Hof, he's kind of on the cutting edge in terms of some of the science around this. I think probably one of the best examples of this is he did a study, and I might not quite get this perfect, but I'll do my best, where essentially a group of his students and him himself, of course, but his students really to demonstrate that anyone can do this and it's not anything unique to him, where they were injected with some sort of like endotoxin that would cause basically fever type response in the body, and basically they found that they were able to suppress this response through the various breathing techniques that he teaches. And that's something that we would have previously thought, maybe that's not possible, but um, he's definitely shown otherwise. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, even of course the cold exposure being one of the more prominent, more interesting ones, where you can extend your ability to stay in some pretty cold temperatures for significant periods of time without going into hypothermia or something. Yeah, really cool stuff.
Yeah, what you're listing is pretty cool stuff. I'd like to do all of that stuff. um, and it's possible with these different types of breath work. I have the feeling that most of them are kind of common. They seem to elicit like common effects in the body, or they work in a common way, where we are usually sort of hyperventilating. At least that's what it feels like. So it looks like we're taking in more oxygen, or taking in more in than we're pushing out of the lungs. Therefore, also taking in more oxygen and oxygenating, oxygenizing the blood, um, more than it is usually. At least, like, I have no idea if that's the mechanism behind it. Can you tell a bit about like what is actually happening in the breath work in terms of what is happening in the body?
Yeah, yeah. So I think this is not very well understood, and it's actually a fairly complex topic, because you also have to start considering carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide's role in terms of allowing your body to absorb oxygen. So honestly, I can't speak really well, really clearly to this. I know I've participated in a number of Wim Hof forums, and there is a decent amount of debate around exactly what's happening with a lot of these techniques. So I think it's a little bit hard to go into exactly what's going on. Um, it does kind of bring me around, honestly, to Buteyko, which I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he has a kind of interesting take on all of this. And his selling point, I guess you could say, is to actually extend our life by breathing a certain way. And the model that he kind of uses for this is in nature. Uh, it's a fairly general rule that animals that breathe more slowly tend to live longer. Of course, smaller things tend to breathe faster and don't live as long, but this is most prevalent in certain animals, such as like naked mole rats that live in what are called hypoxic environments where where there isn't a lot of oxygen, right? And they can live, in spite of the fact of being fairly small rodents, they can live, I think, 20, maybe even 30 years, which is, maybe 5 or 6 times what other rodents of a similar size might live. And sea snakes, for example, I think that they can live up to maybe even 100 years or something. And so creatures that are living in environments that kind of are conducive to less breathing seem to live longer. And sometimes they even have interesting health characteristics. Like I think naked mole rats might be highly cancer resistant, right? So Buteko's whole thing, I think it's best summed up by saying breathe light to breathe right, meaning just breathe less is actually a healthier thing to do. And this is probably a little bit controversial because, of course, we've heard like it's really important to breathe deeply. And I don't think that these two heuristics are necessarily at odds. I think
Hmm.
the idea of breathing deeply is really to explore your capacity, not necessarily breathe fast, right? Um, so yeah, it's another whole area that we could get into, but I did just kind of want to give a shout out to Buteyko there. One of the things that you actually measure if you're into Buteyko method is what's called a controlled pause. And the way that you measure this is essentially just kind of breathing normally for a little bit, and then you kind of hold your breath a little bit somewhere in the middle, I think, and you see about how long until you start to feel a slight urge to breathe. And this is actually correlated, or you could see it as a proxy for overall physical fitness, right? So it essentially what you're measuring is your carbon dioxide tolerance, right? And this can be correlated with your physical abilities, your level of fitness, and apparently how long you can live. But yeah, interesting stuff. Wanted to mention that guy.
Interesting that you brought up this yeah, kind of contradiction between like light breathing and deep breathing, because it's true that usually when you learn about the nervous system, one of the first things you might encounter is that by observing your breath, you'll be able to maybe read the state of your nervous system. And usually they connect shallow breath with an aroused nervous system. And then they would maybe recommend you to, okay, start taking a few deep breaths. So I guess in some contexts, deep breaths can also be helpful, but probably shouldn't be like the default, right? It's not that we should go around and like be super deep breathing all the time.
I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I think it matters how much air you're moving, like the total volume of air that you're moving. So I think that deep breathing can actually be beneficial as long as you're breathing slow and not necessarily breathing a greater total volume of air. I think one of the benefits of deep breathing is that you're exploring the entire capacity of your lungs. Whereas if you're breathing very shallow, likely you're breathing really only in the upper area of your lungs, and that can also be associated with a higher level of agitation. Whereas when you're breathing lower or even exploring the entire capacity, that can be associated with a more regulated nervous system just in general. So I think breathing deep is not necessarily something to be avoided. Breathing deep and fast, right, is a little bit more activating, and it isn't the way that you would want to just be breathing all the time, I would say.
Right. And if we're already talking about let's say the normal breathing, a little bit outside of breathwork, maybe, I think one interesting topic to touch on would be mouth breathing versus nose breathing. Um, in the health conscious scene, there's also lots of talk about this one, and people are really generally recommending to do more nose breathing because the way you take in air is differently. It's getting filters, getting heaters, getting moisturized, everything that doesn't happen when you breathe through your mouth. And then mouth breathing is associated with some problems during sleep apnea, snoring. All of these things supposedly come from habitually mouth breathing. And then there's even like studies have been done, as far as I know, only to animals so far, but that mouth breathing. And don't ask me how they did these studies. Like I don't know if they shut the noses of animals shut or whatever, but somehow they studied this and they noticed that the facial structure of the animals would change pretty rapidly, like after days or weeks, basically. And also the other way around. Once they would be able to breathe through their nose again, the facial structure would change again. I don't know. What's your stance on nose versus mouth breathing?
Yeah, I think pretty consistently in everything that I've read and come across, nose breathing is going to be a little bit more optimal, and there are potentially a lot of issues associated with mouth breathing. I think this book, I think it's called "Breathe" by James Nestor. It's a pretty good introduction, kind of overview to breathing in general, and I think he does mention this in that book. So yeah, they did do some experiments where I think I don't know if they taped or sewed shut the noses of I think it was monkeys or some sort of primate, and yeah, it did change their facial features within I think it was a month or so, where it actually changed them morphologically fairly significantly, right? And these are features that we would typically associate with beauty in general, right? So if you want to look good, you want to breathe, make sure to breathe through your nose, right? Otherwise, your mouth might be a little bit, I think, underdeveloped. But in any case, regardless of that, yeah, breathing through the nose, it does warm the air. It makes it a little bit more moist, and it does also add, I believe, nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, so that you're actually able to absorb the oxygen more efficiently. So yeah, but between those two, generally, you do want to breathe through the nose. Breathing through the mouth, as far as other intentional techniques, does tend to be a little bit more activating of the nervous system. So there are times, if you're doing a specific technique, you might be breathing through the mouth to kind of elicit a more charged emotional state.
Right. In my case, I actually have a problem with nose breathing because for some reason I cannot take in so much air through my nose. So I mean there's ways in which you can practice this and perhaps like widen your nose a little bit. I actually recently bought these in a pharmacy. You can buy nasal strips, which you put on the nose and which kind of open the nose up a bit more, which looks really funny. So I only wear those sometimes for sleeping, which helps against snoring, and then sometimes if I go for a run. Um, I could probably also wear it when I go to the gym, but so far I'm too embarrassed because it looks like really funny. But it does help. Like as soon as you put that on, you can take in so much more air. And then I'm thinking like, okay, is this how other people are able to breathe through their nose? It's kind of nice. Feels just better when you're able to take in more air through the nose. So that's already interesting to experience like those differences. But maybe to go back a little bit to the breath we were talking about, and it's not very well studied like how these effects occur. And also Wim Hof, to be honest, is not very great with explaining like how this stuff actually works. Like he's very enthusiastic, but maybe not so precise in explaining like how does this stuff actually work. Um, but maybe we can like talk a bit about our how does it feel like what's the experience like. Um, a common experience for me when I go into like deeper breath work, like Wim Hof breath work, also with the holotropic breath work, is that when you do these pauses where you first push the air out of your lungs and then you hold. So I guess this is where the CO2 saturates the blood. I'm not sure, but it feels like some kind of tingling in parts of my body, and I don't know what that is exactly, but it feels really good. It feels like the nervous system is like calming down at that moment. Have you experienced this?
Yeah, yeah. So, boy, there's so many different ways we can go with this. Yeah, yeah, I've definitely noticed it. So I first got into these types of breath work maybe like 10 years ago or a little bit more, kind of with the interest of eliciting psychedelic type states, right? At the time, I didn't have access to psychedelics, and I wanted to kind of experiment and dabble with it. Played around for a few years, found Wim Hof, interesting effects coming out of that. Yeah, as far as tingling and stuff, experienced that a decent amount. On one hand, with some of the more intense breathwork techniques, the tingling can become pretty overwhelming, and I think this is where people start to experience what's called tetany. I don't know if you came across this in your holotropic experiences, but this is basically kind of like a freezing of the muscles that can be really, really uncomfortable, and people tend to resist it. I know initially the first few times I experienced it, it was unpleasant. You really don't want it to happen. But yeah. So just while I brought that up, out of curiosity, did you ever experience much tetany in your holotropic experiences?
Yes, I did actually. Like now that you mentioned, I almost forgot about that. What happened there was he had a name for that. He called it kind of the claws or something,
Mhm,
because
yeah.
what typically happens is that it starts in your arms, and your arms kind of do, you form this kind of claw, and this is where the muscles start to cramp up. And yes, that was really uncomfortable. But the person facilitating the holotropic breath work, he warned me before about it, and he said this is something that we will go through. So he said, like, it's kind of part of the process. When this happens, don't stop, but even like breathe harder, breathe into it, or imagine you're breathing into it. And yes, it was really intense, even maybe emotional. And then it would subside after some time, after some waves of breathing. And then it was so it was first they would clamp up, then it would start to tingle intensely, maybe in a way that your leg would tingle after it fell asleep and it woken up again, right? If you were laying on your
Yeah.
on your leg or whatever. And then it felt quite relaxed and ecstatic. So yeah, that was a super interesting thing in the whole tropic breath work.
Yeah, yeah. When I've experienced it before, I associated it with breathing out too much, essentially emptying your lungs a little bit too much. So one of the things that I've told people, and it seems to hold true, but I think to every rule, there's certainly going to be some exceptions, and that's if you're experiencing a lot of tetany, it might mean that you're actually exhaling too much and depriving yourself of carbon dioxide and making it more difficult for your body to get any oxygen because you need a certain bare minimum amount of carbon dioxide in order for your cells to absorb any oxygen. I think it's called the Bohr effect. Um, I don't know if that entirely holds true all of the time. I know in the holotropic area, they do just kind of, you know, uh, go balls to the wall and just like breathe breathe the fuck out of it, right, and just let it go. Um, and that can definitely elicit some very interesting, like, ecstatic type states. I know a few times when I've done, some of the more intense breath work, I've gotten to a point where I mean, it feels like I'm tingling so much, it feels like my body is going to explode, and it honestly, it feels incredibly blissful, right? Like, I mean, a lot of times it'll cause tears to just kinda stream down my face, and I just feel, like, totally full of love, and it's just this overwhelming, like highly psychedelic. I would say that it's very, very similar to some of my, peak psychedelic experiences. And I've tried to guide other people to this place before, but I haven't quite isolated exactly what's going on in order to help other people experience the same thing. For me, usually it comes on after 15 to 20 minutes of the more intense breathwork type sessions, this type of breathwork that I would put under the umbrella of conscious connected breathing, which is essentially where you're just trying to eliminate the pauses, keep the breath moving, keep the breath moving. Generally, I describe it as an active inhale, meaning that you're kind of forcing the inhale, you're getting in as much air as you can, and a passive exhale where you're kind of just letting it out. And that way you're retaining a little bit of carbon dioxide, and you tend to get the tetany a little bit less. Although also over time of doing this technique more and more, I think tetany becomes less of an issue. And it becomes a little bit more comfortable and you don't resist it as much. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit more in the peak experience of that type of breath work. I mean, it can really help release all sorts of emotions. For me personally, usually a lot of crying, but it also feels really easy. Typically, when if I cry and I don't want to, right, there's a certain amount of resistance and it feels kind of like stuck and constricted. But with this type of breath work, oftentimes it just moves very easily and it feels really good, honestly. I mean, afterwards, you feel really light. You feel really just ecstatic, I think is one of the ways to put it.
Yeah, and holotropic breathwork was developed actually like as a means of therapy. And I mean, Stanislav Grof, the guy who invented this, he was really fucking crazy. If you think about it, maybe let's maybe it's a good idea to also go a bit back and explain his story, at least roughly for anybody who might be listening and never heard of Stanislav Grof and holotropic breathwork. He's a Czech scientist who worked with LSD like in the 60s, and was already researching like trauma, um, by utilizing LSD, and was already then mapping out the experiences that people would have, like what they would have in common, sort of transpersonal experiences of people. And then in the 70s, LSD was legalized, or became a scheduled substance, and you couldn't really use it for studies anymore. So he was looking for ways to continue his work. And I think that he just already had studied breathwork in shamanic use in different cultures before, and he already kind of knew that you could achieve some psychedelic states. So he started to develop a framework, like how can you utilize this breathwork to experience these states. And he basically created a breathwork where you can experience very similar states to psychedelics, to LSD. And once you reach those kind of transpersonal states, or maybe even like the ecstatic ones that you described, or the blissful states, it's like almost the same like LSD. So that's, for me, that's already crazy in itself, that he just took breath work, and after that then worked for decades with breath work and with people, and came up with this crazy framework that heals people's trauma, and mapped it out really in detail. So it seems what happens with holotropic breathwork is these releases of emotion happen, like what you described. You can attain these really blissful states, and most likely people go into some kind of a rebirthing experience. So it seems that the birth trauma seems to be a common station in holotropic breathwork that you need to go through somehow. So you will experience at least bits of your birth, which sounds a bit terrifying, but apparently is healing to people. And after that, like if you pass that stage, then you would go into like transpersonal space, where maybe you enter more of the collective unconscious, or he has like lots of experiences of people experiencing stuff from past lives, crazy stuff. But I gotta say, for me, I only had one holotropic breathwork session so far, and I didn't get as deep yet. I only went through the first stage where my hands started to clamp, some releasing of emotions, some first bliss states, and so on. But I would probably need some practice to get in
Mm.
deeper.
Mm. Yeah, Stanislav Grof, he's a very interesting guy. I'd totally recommend his book, Holotropic Breathwork. I haven't actually been through a holotropic session myself, but I am somewhat familiar with how it differs a little bit from some of the shamanic type breath work that you might find around locally. I mean, I remember some of the first times I did it, I went to this yoga studio in Denver, in Colorado, and went through a couple of sessions, and it wasn't like billed as holotropic. Of course, I think it's trademarked, so you got to be like a certified teacher to actually teach holotropic. But I think it does have a lot more than just the breathing around it, right? Like there's a lot of talk of integration in particular, which I think is pretty important just in general. I know they do like mandalas.
There's also a musical element. So there was a very specific music he was playing in the background, which was like almost shamanic drumming, very rhythmical. So that seems to play also an important role.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and the sessions that I've done that are more billed as like shamanic breath work, the music definitely did play an important part. And generally, I know in holotropic they try to go with music that has no words or anything, right? You want to try to make it as focused on your own body as possible. You don't want to be in the head too much. And honestly, I think that's one of the things. That's one of the places where we encounter a lot of resistance to getting into these states, is we start going up into the head, right? Especially when something like tetany or anything uncomfortable starts happening. There tends to be a tendency to resist, a tendency to sort of interpret it in a certain way. A lot of times be worried about it, like, oh, are my hands being stuck this way or something like that, right? It's just going to cause physical damage. I think that's often something that a lot of people find as a block for going deeper with this. You start to worry, like you're experiencing very novel states, something that you're not used to, and you're like, what the heck is going on? Am I going to hurt myself doing this? Um, from my own experience and from everything I've read, it does tend to be pretty safe. I mean, with a few exceptions of people kind of doing some contraindicated Wim Hof breathing and doing intense breath work, like around water or in water, which of course you should not do, right? Because you can pass out. Over the many years that I've been doing this, I can recall one time when I was doing Wim Hof and I pushed myself a little too much and I passed out. I was sitting on the floor. I passed out for, I don't know, 30 seconds or something, and then just came to. I mean, I was perfectly fine. Of course, I was not doing it in water. So again, do not do this type of breath work in water, or really any type of breath work, or in any other case where you could potentially, where it might be dangerous to lose consciousness. Generally, I think it is pretty safe, though. I've done it a ton over the years. I don't think I've experienced any sort of brain damage. Some people do claim that, right, with the holotropic, which can be kind of conflated with hyperventilation, that you can cause, neurological damage. I think generally that does not happen. I'm not familiar with any cases of anyone actually doing any significant harm to themselves.
I agree. It doesn't afterwards. You feel great, so it doesn't feel like you're doing any kind of damage. Although I can also confirm what you're saying, that during the breath work sometimes it feels uncomfortable. And I remember during the whole tropic breath work session, I was like constantly trying to communicate with my guide, because it always felt like, okay, this doesn't feel good when your hands start like clamping up. It feels wrong, and then he would always reassure me and say, no, 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 this is exactly what we want. We continue, we breathe even more intensely into it. So at times it feels wrong, but apparently this is perfect. This is exactly what we're aiming for when we're doing breath work.
Yeah, yeah. To kind of go into a little bit of woo speak here, so to say. I think kind of what you're doing is you're like pumping a lot of energy into the body, right?
Hmm.
And then any place that you might have energetic blockages, for lack of a more coherent term, or something around that, you're going to feel pressure, right? And I think especially in the hands is where you start to feel a lot of that locking up. I mean, it can happen really anywhere in the body. I know with the holotropic, a lot of times you can experience like muscle spasms. I know the first time that I went and did like a shamanic type breath work, I was like kind of frozen in like a pinned down type position. I think it might have been related to some past trauma. I was frozen like that for a while, and it took a while for my body to kind of get out of that. I have also seen and experienced when the breathwork facilitator will kind of come around and actually put their hands on you. And a lot of times that actually seems to like disperse the energy, right? It feels like there's a really intense, localized sensation of the energy, especially when you're feeling, any sort of like tetany or extreme discomfort. And a lot of times if somebody puts their hand on other joints nearby or something, that can actually cause a dispersion. One person that I worked with, they used oh boy, I can't think of the word, but they had little metal tuning forks, and they would
Hmm.
actually like ring the tuning fork and they'd put it on you. And I don't know, she was very intuitive in the way that she used it, like put it on a certain spot on my back and then just like totally dispersed this intensity of energy throughout my entire body. And it felt great, and it really made it easier to move through that experience. And that actually kind of relates back to something that we brought up before, and that was around some of the somatic experiencing, where it can actually be beneficial to sort of expand your awareness of the body when you're experiencing a localized discomfort. So it seems to kind of dissipate the localized intensity and actually allow you to move through it more easily, as if you're carrying something in one area of the body and it's really heavy. It's difficult to deal with. If you can somehow disperse that and carry it with a larger area of the body, the localized load is much less and can be easier to work through those things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
just an aside.
I think it's exactly what is also happening in somatic experiencing, the releasing of stuck energy, for the lack of a better term, but you are able to get to more deeper stuck energy. Imagine how many somatic experiencing sessions you would need to release some kind of muscle cramp in a fetal position that is somehow related to your birth trauma. So for me personally, I would probably need years with a therapist to be able to, in a conscious, sober state, go so deep, in my mind or in my body, that I would reach that trauma or that stuck energy. And this is why these breathwork tools are so helpful, because you dive deep, right? You're able to reach really, maybe really old trauma, or really old stuck emotions in your body. And the same like with somatic experiencing, afterwards we intuitively feel lighter. So when that, what you described, this dispersion of energy happens, either with the help of the facilitator or even just by yourself, by going through the wave of first tension, and then, because we cannot hold tension forever, like there's a limit. If we increase the tension, after some point it releases, and it intuitively feels good. We feel lighter. We feel like, this energy is now gone from the nervous system. So all in all, it's a really cool tool, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, I think that is one of the most powerful aspects of this type of breath work. Is it, very similar to a psychedelic experience. It can significantly, I would say, increase sensations that you otherwise aren't aware of, like muscle tension or something. It can be very subtle. It's something that maybe at some point you've consciously pushed out of your awareness, right? And so you can't really release that muscle tension because you're just simply not aware of it. It becomes chronic. It potentially contributes to health issues, right? And with the breath work, you're just increasing, I would say you're kind of increasing the energy in the body, and that tension becomes so much more apparent. It becomes a lot more uncomfortable, which is, I think, what contributes to a lot of the discomfort you can experience with these types of breath work, right? But it also starts to come into your awareness when, previously it was maybe a little bit more subconscious. And so it presents with you, it presents an opportunity to come into contact with some of that chronic tension and to potentially feel into it and release it, allow it to relax. And that can be just really beneficial. I mean, it can feel like a massage or something even, right? I mean, it feels really good. It can be really, really beneficial from my perspective and experience.
Very well put. I would subscribe definitely to that point. Exactly like you say, it's releasing of stuck tension. Um, what I found interesting, or where I find interested in recently, is also some older frameworks of doing this, because even though, for example, holotropic breathwork was only developed in the 70s, and there's now even newer um, trademarked frameworks coming out of breathwork, like this stuff is obviously very old, perhaps as old as breath. I'm not sure. But at least there's also a recorded history of like shamanic use, what we mentioned, and then also stuff like pranayama, or currently I'm dabbling with Kundalini yoga, and which also has some kind of elements of breath work in there, some kind of breath of fire, maybe some pranayama breathing in there. And it's really interesting because it's these uh, traditions that are maybe old a couple thousand years, and it's basically frameworks or technology to work with breath and with prana, chi, or energy, if we want to use that kind of as a way to explain it. So it's basically frameworks and technologies to get the energy in your body moving. And for a long time, I was thinking that this kind of stuff is nonsense. This is just like esoteric practices that people do because of dogma. But I'm finding it very useful at the moment, and I find it that it's very effective. It's more subtle than maybe holotropic breathwork and these intense ones, but nevertheless, it has an effect maybe on my day when I do it. Maybe it's not
Mm.
life changing, but I can feel a difference in lightness and presence than during the day. Did you dabble with any of these older frameworks?
Yeah. So I have a fairly extensive pranayama practice that I follow. I learned through Sadhguru, both the main practice that they teach, Shambhavi Mahamudra Kriya, which involves a number of different breathwork techniques, as well as the one that they previously called pranayama. I think now it's called Shakti Chanala Kriya. Practice that pretty regularly. It also involves a number of, I would say, fairly well-known techniques without going into the specifics. You can find a lot of these techniques. I think, like you said, they go back probably thousands of years, if not more. And for my money, that's where you find probably the most advanced understanding of some of these techniques. Even though there's certainly a lot of modernized frameworks like Soma breathwork, it's all pretty much coming from these more ancient yogic traditions. And I think that's usually a good source to go to personally, and especially if you can find like a legitimate teacher. Of course, there's the Kriya lineages, which pretty interesting. That's where Yogananda comes from, and that's also what Self Realization Fellowship, his group, teaches a type of Kriya, right? Yeah, all very interesting stuff. And the word Kriya there, I think it basically means movement of energy, right? Like conscious action towards movement of energy within the body. Yeah, prana, I think that's essentially what it means. And a lot of time, I'm with you in that initially I was very put off by anybody talking about energy in the body or something. I'm like, oh, that's not very scientific. That's kind of just BS. And then I experienced some of the more intense breath work, and I'm like, okay, yeah, energy is probably a good term. I don't know what else to call this, right? Something strange is moving through, what's kind of feels like pipes in my body, and there's like pressure, and it feels electric. So yeah, and energy is a reasonable term. Um, just kind of a general way to describe something that is otherwise very difficult to describe. So certainly anyone who's like highly skeptical, I recommend going and trying some of these more intense shamanic type breath work. If you're game for it, then yeah, you might come away with a little bit more open mind around some of that. And yeah, back to the pranayama, I think that there are some really powerful techniques. A lot of them help just preserve your overall health. I know there are some techniques that Sadhguru even offers that are, you can just find on the internet, that can help you avoid respiratory illnesses, because you're expelling a lot. You're moving air very forcefully, right? I know a common one like Bastrika or Kapalabhati, I think skull shining breath. These very forceful techniques. They can also, these are techniques that also potentially produce a lot of heat in the body, right? So if you need to warm up or something, it's kind of cool just how effective they can become. And the more that you practice them, the more effective they become, right? Initially, it might take you, for example, if you're just doing something as simple as alternate nostril breathing, which I'm
Mhm.
a big fan of, right? And I think this one actually helps balance the two hemispheres of the brain. And my understanding is when you're breathing out of the right nostril, it's actually activating the left side of your brain. When you're breathing out of the left nostril, you're actually activating the right side of your brain. And so something like alternate nostril breathing, you're actually kind of increasing crosstalk between the two sides of your brain, and it can be beneficial for your kind of like mental state just in general. It can be very balancing, and with time it can become more effective more quickly. Initially it might take 5-10 minutes before you notice much of an effect, over time, the more you do it, within a couple of minutes or potentially even a couple of breaths, you can start to notice these effects.
Nice. So, for somebody who's not experienced with pranayama breathing, so me, how can I imagine this? How often would you practice this? How long does it take? Is it then, for example, you do one of these, let's say, kriyas or breathing techniques, or is it you go over more of them in a row? How does that work?
Yeah, some of the more complex techniques like the Shakti Chanala Kriya, it involves a number of different techniques that you do. The practice takes probably 35, 45 minutes or so. It's not necessarily very accessible for a number of reasons. So one of the first places to start out with any sort of breath work, if you're interested in breath work and you want to get started and you've never done it before, first just observe your breath. Right. I think that's one of the most important things that you can do just in general. Of course, that's instruction for a lot of meditation as well, and for very good reason. You always have your breath with you, right? So it's a good point of focus, and it can also tell you a lot about your physiological state as well as your mental state. I think I've kind of mentioned this idea before, but the breath is really a two-way street. You mentioned it earlier as well. Essentially, that it can both change the state of the nervous system, and it can also reflect and tell you what the state of the nervous system is. So just start observing your breath, right? Like when I'm happy, I'm going to breathe a little bit different than when I'm mad. Notice those differences, right? And then over time, you can start to learn, okay, well, I notice I'm unhappy right now. Maybe I'm going to start breathing a little bit more like I was happy, and it'll actually start to change potentially your emotional state as well. So that's a good place to start. If you're looking for techniques, there's a number of fairly accessible techniques that I like to recommend people start with. The alternate nostril breathing, it's a pretty easy one. You can find various different instructions out there. Practice it like meditation. The more you practice it, or anything, right? The more you practice it, the more effective it's going to be. I'd say start with at least 5 minutes or so. You want to do 10, 20 minutes a day. That's pretty good. Do it 2 to 3 times a day. That's amazing, right? And I think generally people start fairly small though. Totally understandable, especially since it can take a while to see any effects, right? Kind of similar to meditation. It takes a while to develop a habit, and so I also recommend just reading up about it and understanding some of the benefits. I think the more that you understand the benefits, the more motivated you'll be to actually do it. Another technique that I throw out there, I'll throw out two more techniques just because they're fairly simple, fairly accessible. I like 4-7-8 breathing, which anytime
Hmm.
you come across these numbers, usually corresponds to the number of seconds that you're inhaling, the number of seconds that you're holding, the number of seconds that you're exhaling, and the number of seconds that you're holding. So often you'll find it in fours. But with 4-7-8, it's essentially a 4 second or to a count of four, 4 second inhale, 7 second hold, 8 second exhale. And that breath technique tends to be very calming, right? Any
Hmm.
technique where you are exhaling for longer than you are inhaling tends to be very calming. Any technique where you're inhaling longer than you're exhaling tends to be very activating, right? So just bear that in mind, that just using that heuristic can help you understand how this technique might affect you. For example, if you did like a 6 second inhale rather, and then a 2 second exhale, that breath is going to be very energizing. It's going to really amp you up. If you're feeling anxiety, don't breathe that way, right? Because it will increase your anxiety. So 4-7-8 is a really good one to calm down. It can help you sleep as well. And again, it becomes more effective with practice. One other tip I would suggest around that is allow it doesn't have to be timed seconds, right? So if it's hard, and initially for a lot of people it is, if it's hard to exhale for 8 seconds, count to eight. Just keep the counting, keep the rhythm consistent,
Hmm.
right? So that's one I like to recommend to people. And then another one, a conscious connected technique, which only called that just because there aren't any pauses. Very common one is like 6-6. So 6 second inhale, 6 second exhale, 5 or 6 seconds. This is a very good technique just to practice in general. also a very good technique for what I would call integration or emotional processing. And the reason that is because pauses tend to kind of buffer your emotional state. It kind of tends to repress your emotions to some degree. So any technique that doesn't have pauses is going to start to move your emotions and potentially, stir the pot a little bit.
Nice. That's some really interesting rules you brought up there. I like the one with breathing in is activating, breathing out is calming.
Yeah.
That's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. Um, yeah, these breathworks are super interesting. I feel like for me, after meditation, this is maybe like the next most interesting thing. And similar like meditation, it goes so deep. So it's not something that you can. So it's a simple thing, but to master it or to learn about it, you could do it for years. Maybe lifetimes.
Yeah.
And not without a reason, probably most traditions that have some kind of meditation practice usually also have some breathwork practices. So I can really recommend for anybody who's interested in meditation, you will probably be interested in breathwork once you start doing it, because there's some cool stuff there. Um, Maybe to start wrapping up slowly, let's also drop some recommendations because you also mentioned some books. You mentioned James Nestor Breath or Brief rather, and this one I read a long time ago and I remember it was interesting, so I can probably also recommend that. Any other material or books you would recommend?
Yeah, one of the first ones that I read, I think it was called Just Breathe. It's by this guy, Dan Brule. He's been in the breathwork community and a breathwork teacher for uh, many, many years. He started out as a Navy SEAL, and his book's pretty good. It starts to introduce a few of these topics, like an interesting one, just to kind of throw it out there, is that you have a dominant nostril throughout the day. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So at any given point, you're breathing a little bit more through one nostril than the other. And this might be indicative of which hemisphere of the brain is a little bit more active. And it actually switches throughout the day. It switches depending upon what source you come across, anywhere from every 48 minutes to maybe an hour, or might vary a little bit more. But it's something interesting to become aware of. So yeah, I recommend Dan Brule's book. What else? The Wim Hof book is pretty decent. There's another book that's a little bit more on the side of breath work for athleticism. I think it's called Oxygen Advantage. That one I think mainly goes over buteyko and using increasing your controlled pause. I think they might call it something else in that book. But basically increasing your controlled pause, for health reasons, health and performance reasons. Um, yeah, those are the ones that come to mind. Yeah. Yeah, I think those are the ones I'd probably recommend.
I would maybe add Science of Breath by Swami Rama. This was, I think, the first book that I read about breathwork at all. And I would recommend this because he talks about exactly controlling the autonomic nervous system and how, like, he even goes a bit more into detail how expanding your lungs concretely affects your vagus nerve and then your nervous system. And I don't know all details from the book anymore, but if you're interested in learning how to control your autonomic nervous system, that's the one I recommend.
Yeah. I think that's a great recommendation, and I'd kind of second that, and I'd also throw out there that honestly, if you really, really want to get into it, find some of the yogic masters that are talking about this, and then you'll get pretty deep into it. So I'd recommend that as well. So good call out.
Nice. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I would love to do some holotropic breathwork now, but I don't know. I have to find a new guide around here, but I'm really hyped for it now.
Right. Heck, I'd say I'm always in the kind of DIY category, so I'd say you can practice a lot of these things on your own. I mean, proceed lightly, proceed with caution, of course, But for me, I'm kind of a DIY biohacker, right? So I'd say, yeah, you can practice this at home. Even throw out some quick instructions for it, right? Like lay down, find yourself a nice comfortable position, have some blankets ready because your body temperature can fluctuate a decent amount through these practices. Maybe a mask over your eyes or something to kind of help you focus on your body. Find some nice rhythmic music, kind of shamanic, like drumming or something. There are a number of, if you're on Spotify, look up holotropic breathwork or something. You can find breathwork playlists pretty easily. Throw that on and start breathing by eliminating the pauses. Focus on the inhale, a very active inhale, like, and then a passive exhale, and just keep breathing, right? Do that for 5, 10, 15, 20, an hour, right? And you'll notice some interesting effects, right? Go play with it. That's the best way to learn anything about breath work, is go practice, go play.
There you go. So you have a framework not to try it, and it's free.
Yeah,
Everybody can breathe.
totally. Cool. Well, I think that's a wrap.